Guilt and debts. Schulden. What was the greatest revolution in the way of life for people in Greece in the 6th century BC? It was certainly not the first traces of a new scientific way of thinking, nor was it the Greek alphabet. It was that obscure object of desire that we call money. Money changed everything: social relationships and personal manners, law and status, morality, power dynamics, intellect, and thinking. And even the history of philosophy is closely linked to the history of the monetary economy. In fact, the Greeks did not invent coinage. According to legend, it was the Phoenicians. And they unfortunately invented too little of it, as the poet Nestroy put it. In reality, the credit for minting the first coins goes to the Lydians, exactly that Anatolian power that had subdued Miletus in the middle of the 6th century BC. Already many decades earlier, between 650 and 600 BC, the use of coinage began in Lydia. Everything started with somewhat shapeless small chunks of a natural mixture of silver and gold, known as electrum. Although his predecessor Alyattes II had begun minting coins, the beginning of international monetary economy is generally associated with the Lydian king Croesus, around 595 BC to 546 BC. His wealth in coinage became legendary, and the supply of gold from the mines between Atarneus and Pergamon seemed endless. In no time, the Lydian krosai became the standard currency of the time in the eastern Mediterranean. Around the same time, the first electrum coins began to be minted in Miletus. Many other cities around the Aegean quickly followed suit. Aegina minted the first silver coins around 550 BC, and soon after, Corinth and Athens followed. The transformation of life in ancient Greece through coinage is hard to overestimate. Within just a few decades, the monetary economy changed trade, social hierarchies, warfare, and traditional moral concepts. A quick look into the world of the Iliad and the Odyssey clearly shows that Homer's heroes did not strive for money, which didn't exist in their time, but for time, for status and honor. Desirable life goals included general approval, the image of bravery, a large number of followers and livestock, and a few valuable items to boast about. Organized trade is not present in this world, only barter from man to man. The first fragments of hack silver, obolos, which appeared as currency around 700 BC, don't seem to have changed this much. Payments were still made with gifts, mainly livestock, with cattle being the most valuable. As the nobility expanded its dominance in the 7th century BC and acquired more and more land, small farmers around the Aegean increasingly fell into debt servitude. One can hardly imagine the situation of debtors as badly as it actually was. Debt law in the 7th century BC was as ruthless as it was brutal. Falling into debt to someone else was both a moral and an economic offense, and the concepts of guilt and debt had not yet been separated. How did goods commonly change ownership in those times? Through robbery, exchange, or gift. The latter two forms of ownership transfer are particularly interesting. If a farmer lends another a few cows because his animals have perished in an epidemic, it is customary to later return more cows than were received in the time of need. The loan was voluntary and generous, but the return was out of obligation. To balance this moral disparity, Hesiod recommends adding a little extra out of gratitude. However, this well-intentioned practice becomes a harmful structure when the lender always expects to receive more than what was given or lent. What began as an act of friendship becomes a good business deal for the lender. He becomes the creditor, and the borrower becomes the debtor. If the debtor cannot repay the debt with the additional return, he must borrow again, and so on. To prevent abuse by the debtor, the law grants the creditor full authority. The debtor must pledge himself and his possessions to the creditor. His family members fall into debt servitude, and the creditor can enslave the debtor and his family. What is particularly harsh about this archaic concept of debt is that it was not seen as something subjective. For someone who owed something, they were condemned as a whole person. Their wrongdoing appeared to others as an objective debt to the world and to the gods, thus a defilement of the entire person. From this perspective, the debt could also be transferred and inherited by their family members, as inherited sin and inherited guilt. By the end of the 7th and the beginning of the 6th century BCE, the debt crisis among small farmers in relation to the aristocratic landowners must have been widespread. The most famous and pioneering example of this is the situation in Athens and its surroundings. Compared to Miletus, Athens was not yet a major power at the start of the 6th century BCE. However, the rising city faced a civil war. The social divisions were escalating, primarily due to debt bondage. Thousands of small farmers had become dependent and, at the same time, outcasts. Their suffering and their inner turmoil were oppressive and dangerous for the polis. The situation must have been so threatening that Solon, ca. 640 BCE, ca. 560 BCE, who was appointed as an arbitrator, annulled all existing debts. The debt stones bound countless dark-colored lands to Mother Earth, he is said to have lamented. Although no debt stones from the 6th century BCE have been found in Attica. According to his own account, he gave instructions to tear up the debt stones from the fields, farms, and vineyards. Solon denounces the greed and excess of the aristocracy and cancels all debts. The enslaved debtors are set free and given back their former property. From now on, no debtor should have to fear losing their life or that of their family members due to their debts. In return, Solon opposed the small farmers' demand for a fairer distribution of land. The property relations remained as they had been before, only now the rules of the debt system were friendlier. The same applies to the political order in the city. The influence of individual citizens in Athens, after Solon's reforms, depends on their social status, meaning their economic success. Since, at the beginning of the 6th century BCE, the exact date of the reforms is disputed, there was still no coinage in Athens. Supplies of grain, oil, and wine, as well as the ownership of horses and hoplite equipment for war, were used to measure wealth, traditional criteria of aristocratic prosperity. Significantly, the new order enters history with the term timocracy, the rule of the honorable. Honor and wealth are equated. The old aristocratic term time subtly changes its meaning. One is honorable if one possesses wealth, and one who possesses wealth is honorable. This equation is officially cemented in Solon's reform work. Those who own more have more honorable political influence, while those who own less have less. A societal condition that has never fundamentally changed in any country in the world. The nature of money, that people make profits through lending and others fall into debt, is not new. When half a century after Solon's reforms, coinage appears. At first glance, it is hardly more than a practical invention. The new coins significantly ease the payment transactions in trade. One can now better calculate fines and fees, pay taxes and tributes, and pay soldiers their wages, turning them into mercenaries and soldiers. Instead of plundering conquered territories and ruining them, they are now required to pay taxes in the form of money. The profession of banker arises, exchange offices are established, sums of money are invested and allocated, goods are paid for with money, and loans and credits are granted, while wars are fought over gold and silver mines. However, these superficial changes do not explain how the monetary economy fundamentally alters the consciousness of people in a short period of time. To understand this, we must philosophically examine the nature of money. Trading a painted vase for a golden animal sculpture means taking both as objects seriously. They may be used as a medium of exchange, but only incidentally. Considering a coin as money means seeing its value solely in its function as a means of payment. It no longer holds value as a valuable object in itself, but is exclusively a tool to an end. As an abstract thing, money is a paradox in itself. For abstract things do not exist in nature, just as there is no gaseous vertebrate. When two children exchange their toys, as people did before the introduction of coinage, the fire truck and the soccer ball do not only have a material value. Their value lies in what it personally means for the two children involved to own the truck or the ball. Personal motives, such as cherished memories, or the origin of the toy as a gift from their parents, play a role. And some of these possessions are simply non-exchangeable for such reasons. However, buying a truck or a ball in a store is free from such personal motives. When money and monetary value become decisive, everything else is abstracted. This literally means it is separated. Money does not appear in this exchange as a valuable commodity, but merely as an abstract symbol. And the more a culture deals with abstract symbols, the more intellectually demanding it becomes. Value relationships must now be assessed for their proportionality, and value developments must be precisely calculated. What will be more expensive next year, wine or grain? What is the better deal, the more profitable investment under certain conditions? By its nature, money is characterless. It does not consider customs and traditions or values. Anything that can be considered a commodity becomes comparable to other commodities and measured against a third, money. Where money reigns, everything becomes reified. And the only value that money acknowledges is the price. In other words, more or less money. As Karl Marx and Georg Simmel pointed out in the 19th century, money is the only thing in the world whose quality is measured solely by quantity. For the moral logic of money, the distinction between good and bad is remarkably simple. A lot of money is good and little money is bad, a morality that only very few people seriously question. The insight appears so convincing that it does not invite discussion. The new, ruthless objectivity of money triggers a revolution in the Greek city-states from the late 6th century BCE. It gradually establishes a completely new worldview. Of course, an increase in land, livestock, and treasures has always been desirable. But unlike land ownership and household goods, money forces expansion. It loses value when left idle, and this was true not only in our times, but also in antiquity. Even more important is that from now on, one can and must calculate their transactions precisely. Large parts of life, which were previously beyond personal control, become calculable. And the skillful handling of money no longer requires wisdom, but new abilities such as cunning, flexibility, and ruthlessness, not intelligence, but trickery. Society as a whole is in upheaval, and each individual city-state in Greece faces new problems and challenges. For example, Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver of Sparta in the 6th century BCE, is said to have banned all gold and silver coins, an attempt to change the wind direction with a bellows. For from the 5th century BCE onward, almost all commercial transactions are carried out with coinage. And the agora, the place for public debates and citizen assemblies, is also the marketplace. Here, the urban and political space of the polis merges with the new way of thinking, which is governed by calculation and sophistication. Both worlds blur together and begin to fuel each other, in the question of a reasonable constitution, as well as in the question of the fair measure in jurisprudence. It is always about abstracting things, objectifying them, measuring them, finding the right measure, and calculating. But to measure and evaluate something, one needs a vast amount of abstract knowledge about numbers and arithmetic. Pythagoras. It must have been a sublime feeling that overcame the first mathematicians when they realized they could calculate nature with numbers. What joy and fulfillment it must have brought to see a calculation or equation work out. All at once, the folds in the cloak of the world open, revealing the hidden logic in nature, its laws and regularities. Such a feeling, along with great accompanying pride, must have seized the man who entered the history books as one of the most significant pioneers of mathematics and philosophy. Pythagoras, known to all school children through a mathematical theorem that, like so much else surrounding him, did not actually originate from him. Nevertheless, he was a significant figure, even if only a fraction of what is said about him were true. Pythagoras was born around 570 BCE on Samos, roughly at the same time that Thales and Anaximander were at the height of their influence in Miletus. At about the age of 40, he is forced to leave the island off the coast of Asia Minor. And for good reason. If one were to ask which ruler in ancient Greece was the greatest scoundrel, there would be many strong candidates, but an especially fitting choice would undoubtedly be Polycrates of Samos. An opportunistic tyrant who seeks and finds his own advantage in the power struggle between Egypt and Persia. Fratricide, piracy, betrayal, deceit, greed, and avarice are the traits with which he enters history. Polycrates would become famous for posterity primarily through Friedrich Schiller's ballad, The Ring of Polycrates, and through his conflict with Pythagoras, a man whose greatness would far overshadow his own. When Polycrates came to power in 538 BCE, a conflict must have arisen between the two very different men. Pythagoras left the island around 530 BCE and went to southern Italy to the prosperous city of Croton. The cities of southern Italy resembled the trade metropolises of Asia Minor. Located on rugged coastlines, they engaged in trade with both the eastern and western Mediterranean. Here in Calabria, which had long been settled by Greeks, Pythagoras founded a philosophical school in the form of a monastic-like community. He quickly became an influential man, actively involved in city politics, and gathered a large following around him. But what is the nature of his teachings? For some, he is a guru, a shaman, and a cult leader who devoted himself entirely to a homemade esoteric philosophy. For others, Pythagoras is a clear-headed genius who advanced mathematics, natural sciences, and even music theory, significantly furthering logical thinking. While some do not attribute the mathematical and scientific insights credited to him to his work, others see him as a pioneer of rational thought. According to this view, the Pythagoreans were the first to interpret reality not just through experience, but also with the help of theoretical concepts. How was Pythagoras seen by his followers? Was he admired or even worshipped as a superhuman being? All the accounts about him date from much later times, mostly from ancient Rome. There is no single line we can say with certainty actually comes from the master himself, and not from his students and later followers. In this sense, historians have mostly pieced together their own version of Pythagoras, depending on how they wanted to perceive him. It is certain that he dealt with arithmetic and geometry, though in a way that seems quite unscientific by today's standards. For him, mathematical laws were part of a mystical cosmos, ordered by secret logics and symbolic relationships. For the Pythagoras fans who want to see him primarily as a clear-sighted scientist, this poses a significant problem. Conversely, those who regard Pythagoras as a guru make considerable efforts to label all his mathematical work as esoteric. That a thinker in the 6th century BCE, in a trading hub like Croton, engaged with numbers and mathematics is not surprising. While some aspects may seem esoteric, the philosophical engagement with numbers had a very close practical connection. According to Aristoxenus of Tarent in the 4th century BCE, Pythagoras' philosophy of numbers was derived from commercial practice. Furthermore, he is said to have improved measures and weights. Pythagoras, together with his followers, actively intervened in the day-to-day affairs of the polis in a very worldly way. The worlds of politicians, traders, mathematicians, and philosophers had not yet been separated. Undoubtedly, the mathematics of Pythagoras and his school received significant impulses. Like money, number is something highly abstract. Here, too, the only quality is quantity. The 4 seasons are different from the 4 evangelists and the 4 musketeers, but the number 4 ties them together. Everything can be expressed quantitatively through numbers, completely independent of its quality. Parallel to the monetary economy and closely linked with it, the study of numbers focuses on the quantitative dimension of life. The study of numbers, arithmos, becomes arithmetic. Time can be divided mathematically, just as space can be geometrized. And even though the saying attributed to Pythagoras, "everything is number," comes from a later time, the Pythagoreans certainly sharpened the focus on this idea. The Pythagoreans paid particular attention to the decimal system. It had the practical advantage of being easy to work with using one's fingers. It was already used in ancient Egypt. Pythagoras, or more likely his disciples, turned it into a kind of mystical science. If you add the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 together, the sum is 10, the greatest non-composite number. This number was considered sacred by the Pythagoreans. For them, the number 10 permeated the entire cosmos, ordering it according to mathematical laws. In the quantities, the Pythagorean school also saw qualities expressed. Even numbers were thought to be feminine and limitless, while odd numbers were considered masculine and limited. Did the Pythagoreans turn mathematics into religion and religion into mathematics? Part of the mystery can be resolved by considering that, during Pythagoras' time, the 2 worlds were not yet distinctly separated. It was quite in keeping with the spirit of the time to place sober insights, such as a mathematical law, into a higher cosmic context. To separate the 2, as we tend to do today, would have seemed strange to the Greeks of the 6th century BCE. Astronomy, for example, seems inseparably linked with astrology, and chemistry would remain closely connected to alchemy for a long time. For over 2 millennia, these fields would retain the status of secret arts rather than natural sciences. Pythagoras likely brought his knowledge from research trips to Egypt and Babylonia. In both of these ancient civilizations, mathematics and astronomy were primarily studied by priests, and thus they were strongly intertwined with religion and mysticism. The Babylonians and the Egyptians already knew the theorem about the right-angled triangle, which is now named after Pythagoras. Whether he added something like a mathematical proof to this discovery is highly speculative. It is also unclear what exactly Pythagoras' contribution to astronomy was, though the details likely do not matter much. The special emphasis on the originality of an idea is a much later characteristic. It gains significant importance only in advanced industrial and service societies with their patents and copyright laws. Most of what we know about Pythagorean astronomy comes from Philolaus. He was born sometime after the death of the master, probably around 470 BCE. What Philolaus wrote is considered today to be undifferentiated Pythagorean thought. According to him, the world consists of two principles, the indeterminate and the determinate, or the limited and the unlimited. Both are fundamentally different and are connected and kept in balance through harmony. Harmony is what holds the world together at its core. This harmony is made evident through numerical ratios. This means it can be recognized and calculated mathematically. The number, therefore, takes on immense significance, for it is impossible to grasp or recognize anything in thought without it. Apparently, however, Philolaus did not just mean that the cosmos can be calculated through numbers, but that it is made of numbers. For him, if we believe Aristotle, numbers are an objective physical reality, and thus far more than just a tool of the human mind. Under these premises, Philolaus develops his cosmogony. At the center of the universe, there is a central fire. Surrounding it, the Earth orbits, a sphere. This is the first time it is mentioned that the Earth is spherical. It is also highly noteworthy that, according to Philolaus, the Earth should no longer be at the center of the world. None other than Nicolaus Copernicus will later refer to this almost 2,000 years later. Just like the Earth, the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn all orbit the central fire. The rest of the cosmology is less groundbreaking and highly speculative. While Philolaus correctly recognizes that the Earth rotates on its axis, he uses this fact to explain why the central fire cannot be seen. It is supposed to always shine on the other side of the Earth. It is quite clear that Philolaus only considered one side of the Earth to be inhabited. However, he did speculate that there might be inhabitants on the Moon. How much of this cosmogony can be traced back to Pythagoras is unclear, as mentioned earlier. What seems clearer is that another idea of the Pythagoreans originates from the master himself, the idea of the harmony of the spheres. The structure of the heavens is a creation of harmony and number. Philolaus also assumes that the cosmos is held together by harmony. Pythagoras evidently imagined this harmony not only physically, but also acoustically. According to this, the planets produce sounds as they orbit, creating a cosmic sound together. However, the music of the cosmos is not audible to humans because it continuously resounds. Our ears, therefore, do not have the sensory capacity for the cosmic sound, much like how one cannot see the stars in a brightly lit city at night. Just as light pollution exists today, the cosmic sounds produce a form of noise pollution. The Pythagoreans applied their mathematical insights to all other areas of life and knowledge. One can, writes Philolaus, see the nature of number and its power not only in the world of the gods, but also everywhere in all human works and speeches, in all technical activities, and in music. In particular, the thinking in numbers proves highly fruitful in music. The Pythagoreans recognized that harmonic intervals can be expressed in numerical ratios. When you shorten the string of an instrument by half, you hear an octave. A shortening in the ratio of 2/3 produces a fifth, and a ratio of 3/4 produces a fourth. The pitch of the notes is thus dependent on the length of the vibrating string, in an exact mathematical proportional relationship. Just as the celestial mathematics dictates the sounds of the planets in the cosmos, so too does it govern the sounds on a musical instrument. However, when Pythagoras speaks of tones, he is not concerned with acoustics themselves. He assumes that gods and humans, the heavens and the earth, share a universal friendship, united in a universal order, the cosmos. Circle of power. The Pythagoreans are the first true school of thought in the Western world, and as we will see, they are immensely influential. They absorb much of what they encounter, such as the knowledge of Egyptian and Babylonian mathematics and astronomy. From all this emerges a school that is both spiritual and mathematical, taking on many individual forms. Each Pythagorean, it seems, creates their own elixir from these ingredients. Completely unmathematical, yet highly legendary, is the great significance of friendship for the Pythagorean communities. This, too, is told with romantic pathos in a Schiller ballad, Die Bürgschaft, the pledge. Damon, who fails in an assassination attempt on Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse, is sentenced to death. However, since he still needs to marry off his sister, Damon asks his friend to stand as a guarantor for him to the king. In the end, Damon is freed despite the greatest obstacles, and even the dark ruler is deeply moved by this loyalty of friendship. Nearly everything about this story is invented, but it is rooted in the legendary ideal of friendship among the Pythagoreans. Behind this friendship lies a philosophical concept. Just as the cosmos is supposed to be harmoniously ordered, people are meant to strive to live in harmony with others. This friendship clearly encompasses everything: the relationship of a person to themselves, their spouse, their children, friends, and fellow humans. Everywhere, the opposing and conflicting forces should be reconciled through the harmony of friendship. Nevertheless, the Pythagoreans often found themselves in fierce conflicts with their fellow humans. Pythagoras and his many followers in the South Italian cities did not live in seclusion. On the contrary, they actively participated in politics, leading to frequent confrontations. A likely cause of this was the aristocratic attitude of the Pythagoreans. Despite their ideal of a modest lifestyle, they sympathized more with the wealthy than with the common people. They aroused envy, and the elitist and mysterious nature that fascinated some about the Pythagoreans may have made others highly suspicious. The school of Pythagoras in Croton, and later elsewhere, represented a circle of power. The master is said to have played a leading role in the war between Croton and the neighboring rival Sybaris. Despite the victory of Croton, Pythagoras later fell into disgrace and fled with many followers to Metapontion, a Greek colony in the hollow of the Italian boot between Heraclea and Tarent. There, he continued to gather followers and carry on his work. Decades after his death, in the last years of the 6th or the early 5th century BCE, the Pythagoreans were severely persecuted and displaced in southern Italy. Only in Tarent did they persist until well into the 4th century BCE. Philolaos is also said to have lived there until he was evidently forced to emigrate to Greece. One should not reduce Pythagoras to just his role as a guru or that of a sober, ascetic mathematician. Consider the statement of Aristoxenus, who said that the philosophy of numbers originated from commercial practice. Aristoxenus came from the community in Tarent shaped by the Pythagoreans, and had a Pythagorean teacher. The philosophy of numbers, the theory of proportions, mathematics, and economics were likely closely interconnected. Each influenced the other, thereby changing the significance of rational and logical thinking, and with it, Greek culture. Interestingly, Pythagoras is the only philosopher to have ever appeared on the cover of an ancient coin. Not once, but twice. Around 430 to 420 BCE, the face of the philosopher of numbers appeared on coins from the city of Abdera. Many centuries later, Samos, his birthplace, claimed its lost son and depicted him in the pose of a ruler with a scepter. The new coinage economy, combined with newfound knowledge of arithmetic, proportion, and measurement, contributed to the rapidly growing importance of logos, reason. But measurement, proportion, and logical world order have another very earthly dimension, namely, the measurement of justice, fairness, and a just world order. What holds the cosmos together in a rational way should also define the rational order among humans. For the measure of all human deeds and misdeeds is law. Heraclitus. Not far from Samos, and also from Miletus, lies the city of Ephesus, which was conquered by the Persians. It is also a trading metropolis and the home of Pythagoras' most significant philosophical adversary, Heraclitus. Born around 520 BCE, about 50 years after the great guru of Croton, Heraclitus was hardly in direct competition with Pythagoras. However, Heraclitus' disdain for Pythagoras was as great as the latter's fame, which had spread from southern Italy all the way to Ephesus. Heraclitus, who throughout his life neither measured nor calculated nor researched nature and invented nothing, criticizes Pythagoras harshly. While he acknowledges that Pythagoras had studied more than any other man, much of what Pythagoras taught was, according to Heraclitus, not of his own making. For Heraclitus, the celebrated sage was a great swindler, whose vast knowledge only concealed the fact that he understood the things he spoke of very superficially, if at all. As always, with such a harsh rebuke of a rival, it reveals as much about Heraclitus as it does about Pythagoras. Clearly, one envies the other's fame. What we think we know about Heraclitus as a person does not sound very sympathetic. He came from an aristocratic family and is said to have refused to play an important role in the city as a royal sacrificial priest. His attitude toward his fellow citizens is conveyed in the following statement: "The Ephesians should all hang themselves, every last man, and leave their city to the unworthy. These men who drove out Hermodorus, their best citizen, saying, 'Let none among us be the best. If anyone must be, let him be so elsewhere, and among others.'" Hermodorus was likely a well-known local politician. Aside from him, only Bias of Priene, a statesman from the time of Thales, surrounded by legend, receives praise from the grumbler. All other notable figures are accused by Heraclitus of stupidity and foolishness. Homer, he believed, should be banished from the games and flogged. The poet Hesiod supposedly did not even know the difference between day and night. The philosopher Xenophanes and the geographer Hecataeus had, in his view, learned much, but understood little. With Heraclitus, quarrels and misanthropy enter philosophy, but so too does a significant expansion and elevation of logos. One also marvels at the immense self-confidence of philosophy, when one of its leading figures dismisses everything that had previously been revered as tradition. Yet with Heraclitus, we encounter the familiar problem that we often cannot say with certainty what he actually meant. Only fragments of his statements have been passed down to us, cited and collected by later authors, such as Plato, Aristotle, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus of Rome, and Diogenes Laertius. These statements are often enigmatic and ambiguous. They are extremely condensed and frequently paradoxical. No wonder that since antiquity, Heraclitus has been called the obscure. He frequently plays with words and double meanings. His sentences are linguistically sophisticated, at once cryptic and elusive, resembling the prophecies of an oracle. Heraclitus appears to us simultaneously as both a mystic and a semanticist, a prophet and a master of concepts. A special role within his fragments is played by the concept of justice. For the first time, a philosopher of the Western world speaks of nomos, in the sense of law. Anaximander had already linked the cosmic sphere with that of justice, as previously shown. The Pythagoreans, too, preached in their concept of friendship that anyone wishing to live in harmony with their fellow citizens must faithfully follow the laws of the polis. But it is only with Heraclitus that law and justice find their fixed place between earth and sky, as the earthly counterpart to a higher cosmic reason. For Heraclitus, logos is not of this world. Logic and reason belong to a divine realm, a world of absolutes. Unfortunately, however, only a few seem capable of recognizing and understanding this logos. Although Heraclitus acknowledges that all human beings have the capacity to know themselves and to think rationally, he believes that most fail to make use of it. All are allowed to think, but many are spared the trouble. Most people exist in a fog of personal perspectives and subjective opinions. They have views on everything, but no awareness of the great clear truth that governs the world. In contrast, the first commandment is to abandon the sphere of personal opinions and commit to the objective truth shared by all. Therefore, one must follow what is common. Even though the world law logos is shared by all, most people live as if they had a wisdom of their own. The logos is supra-individual. Whoever explores the logos explores the totality of reality, cosmos. And whoever explores the cosmos may, like Heraclitus, say of themselves, "I have searched myself." The Greek idea of the world is always linked to the human being, and knowledge of the world and self-knowledge are inseparable. In human life, the logos manifests in law and justice. These represent the universal, to which people must submit regardless of their personal opinions, as it embodies a higher reason. For centuries, law had been subject to the arbitrary rule of aristocratic landowners. However, in Ephesus and elsewhere during Heraclitus's time, there seems to have been a legal order that applied equally to all citizens, even if not in the sense of truly independent courts as understood today. In one of his most famous fragments, he declares, "The people must fight for their law as for their city wall." The Greek cities only became true city-states once a wall enclosed their territory. Just as the city wall protects the polis from external enemies, the law, according to Heraclitus, must safeguard its internal cohesion and civic resilience. In the same spirit, he asserts, one must build upon what is common to all, as a city builds upon its law, and even more firmly. Yet Heraclitus's analogy between the divine logos and human law is neither peaceful nor harmonious. The harmony, reconciliation, and universal friendship preached by the Pythagoreans strike him as naive idealism. His logos, his world law, and his concept of justice are combative. The logos, indeed the entire world, consists of opposing forces in perpetual struggle. One must know that conflict is common to all, that strife is justice, and that all things happen through opposition and necessity. Conflict, Heraclitus declares, is the father of all things. For Heraclitus, the unity of the world arises through the tension of opposites. The cold becomes warm, the warm cold, the wet dries, the dry moistens. What resists itself comes together, and from opposing tones arises the most beautiful harmony. All things happen through strife. One and the same thing manifests as living and dead, waking and sleeping, young and old. For this transformed becomes that, and that, transformed again, becomes this. Here, too, the emerging monetary economy has left its imprint on thought. Goods transform into money, and money back into goods. Heraclitus asserts that everything that exists is simultaneously defined by and contains its own opposite, an idea of profound consequence. This principle, later termed dialectical thinking by Plato, would shape the history of philosophy. In particular, Zeno of Elea, c. 492 c. 430 BCE, would emerge as a master of dialectic, crafting several famous paradoxes. If the world is to be dialectical by nature, it is no surprise that Heraclitus' style of language is so dark. Many of his sayings not only assert this dialectic conceptually, but also express it linguistically. Presumably, Heraclitus felt in harmony with the absolute logos, and believed he was writing as the world truly is. For a modern philosopher, this would be an audacious presumption. However, in 500 BCE, it was evidently too early for a critical reflection on one's own capacity for knowledge. Often, Heraclitus resorts to metaphors. According to Hippolytus of Rome, who preserved this saying in the early 3rd century CE, he is reported to have said, "A judgment over the world and all things within it will happen through fire, for everything will be judged and grasped by the fire that approaches." Fire, for Heraclitus, is a symbol of destruction and rebirth, becoming and perishing. However, the idea that fire was the original substance, arche of all things, is likely a unique interpretation by Aristotle. A similar claim applies to the famous phrase, "everything flows," which Plato regards as the essence of Heraclitus' thought. If everything arises and perishes through opposition, then there can be no clearly separated forces within the law, no absolute good or evil. The divine justice that Heraclitus envisions is a judgment through fire. It is fiercely contested through speech and counterspeech, in individual legal disputes, as well as in the establishment of laws in the polis. Interests collide, and as a result of often violent strife, a new legal order emerges. Heraclitus is far from advocating democratic law. For him, the source of law is not the will of the majority, but the one divine. And this divine one is not good and moral, as many later philosophers would argue, but rather the irreconcilable opposition of good and evil, a concept that will deeply fascinate Heraclitus' admirer, Friedrich Nietzsche, at the end of the 19th century. Heraclitus asserts that the logos exists objectively in the world. Likewise, he seems to believe that law and justice are objective, even though they are formulated by humans. Such a belief in an objective legal order is foreign to us today. Instead, we resign ourselves, for better or worse, to accepting the law within our society. In any case, we do not consider it divine. Human judgments are not divine judgments. What did Heraclitus achieve? As a dialectician, he is far better than Pythagoras at explaining where human discord originates in an otherwise harmonious universe. Hesiod's Pandora's box, from which evil is released, has long lost credibility. And the Pythagorean optimism about friendship seems highly exaggerated. In contrast, the idea that all opposites form a unity and that contradictions in the world are entirely natural appears far more forward-looking. On the other side of the balance sheet, however, stands a demon with which Heraclitus has long bewitched the philosophical tradition. His fragments are highly doctrinaire. They seem to contain no doubt, no pondering over why the Logos has chosen to reveal itself to Heraclitus and not to someone else. No reflection on how the absolute world, beyond everyday experience, could have entered his own mind untainted, and no consideration of how his claims could be thoroughly justified. Positively formulated, Heraclitus is the prototype of the self-assured, world-renouncing seer, an often imitated role model in philosophy. In this sense, he may be the first truly typical philosopher. Negatively turned, however, Heraclitus marks the beginning of philosophy's hubris. Where the Ionian philosophers, and perhaps even the Pythagoreans, sought plausible explanations for the cosmos and its happenings, Heraclitus delivers judgments on the world with the blunt certainty of a woodsman. His statements, though written on papyrus, seem as if chiseled in stone. And like other early stewards of the Logos, mathematicians and perhaps successful merchants, Heraclitus regards himself as a superior species. Such pride easily leads to contempt for the masses. Despite his veneration of the Logos, his philosophy bears a strongly anti-enlightenment streak. If the people of his time are too stupid anyway, as he asserts in 13 of his fragments, then there is no real need to enlighten them. The philosopher becomes the proud outsider, dismissing society and politics as beneath him,